Question 1. Research into Iowa's permit to carry weapons regulations has revealed that a valid permit is required for carrying a handgun in public. Considering the legal framework of Iowa, which of the following represents the most responsible and legally sound approach to understanding and adhering to these regulations? Option A. Thoroughly review the Iowa Code sections related to carrying weapons, prohibited locations, and justifiable use of force, and consult official sources for clarification on any ambiguities. Option B. Rely on informal advice from friends or online forums regarding the interpretation of Iowa's firearms laws and prohibited carrying locations. Option C. Assume that permit to carry allows for carrying a firearm in any public place, as long as the individual feels it is necessary for their protection. Option D. Carry a firearm only in situations where an immediate threat is perceived, without specific regard to whether the location itself is legally restricted for firearm carry. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly review the Iowa Code sections related to carrying weapons, prohibited locations, and justifiable use of force, and consult official sources for clarification on any ambiguities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal responsibilities and potential consequences of carrying a firearm in public. The decision-making process must be grounded in a thorough understanding of Iowa's specific laws regarding the permit to carry weapons, including where firearms are prohibited and the circumstances under which force may be justified. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to severe legal repercussions, including criminal charges and the revocation of a permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive and informed approach to understanding and adhering to Iowa's permit to carry weapons regulations. This means thoroughly reviewing the Iowa Code, specifically sections pertaining to carrying weapons, prohibited areas, and the justifiable use of force. It also entails seeking clarification from official sources, such as the Iowa Department of Public Safety or legal counsel, when any doubt arises about the legality of carrying a firearm in a particular location or situation. This approach ensures that the individual's actions are consistently aligned with legal requirements and ethical considerations, minimizing the risk of unintentional violations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that a valid permit to carry automatically grants unrestricted access to all public spaces with a firearm. This overlooks specific prohibitions outlined in Iowa law, such as carrying in courthouses, schools, or private property where the owner has posted signage prohibiting firearms. Relying on such assumptions can lead to immediate legal violations. Another incorrect approach is to interpret the right to carry as a license to engage in vigilantism, or to use a firearm preemptively in situations that do not present an immediate threat of death or serious injury. Iowa law, like most jurisdictions, restricts the justifiable use of force to situations where it is necessary to prevent imminent harm. Acting outside these parameters, even with a permit, can result in criminal charges. A further incorrect approach is to neglect ongoing education and awareness of legal changes. Laws can be amended, and interpretations can evolve. Failing to stay informed about updates to Iowa's firearms regulations means an individual might unknowingly be operating outside the current legal framework, even if they were compliant at the time they obtained their permit. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility. This framework involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements of the jurisdiction Iowa Code. 2. Proactively seeking clarification on ambiguous situations. 3. Regularly reviewing and updating knowledge of relevant laws. 4. Applying a strict interpretation of when force is justified, focusing on imminent threats. 5. Recognizing that a permit is a privilege, not an absolute right, and carries significant responsibilities. Question 2. System analysis indicates that an Iowa permit to carry weapons holder is observing a group of individuals loitering in a public park after posted closing hours. The individuals are not being disruptive or aggressive, but their presence makes the permit holder feel uneasy. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder in this situation? Option A. Immediately display their firearm to deter the individuals from remaining in the park. Option B. Call law enforcement to report the individuals for loitering, demanding immediate police action. Option C. Maintain situational awareness, avoid confrontation, and if concerned about personal safety, discreetly leave the area. Option D. Approach the individuals and inform them that they are violating park rules and must leave. Correct answer is C. Maintain situational awareness, avoid confrontation, and if concerned about personal safety, discreetly leave the area. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the responsibility to act lawfully and avoid unnecessary escalation. The decision to carry a firearm in Iowa, even with a permit, necessitates a constant awareness of legal boundaries and responsible conduct. Misjudging a situation can lead to legal repercussions, endanger oneself or others, and undermine the privilege granted by the permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever possible, while remaining aware of one's surroundings and legal rights. This approach prioritizes safety and adherence to Iowa law, which permits carrying a handgun for self-defense, but does not mandate or encourage its use in non-threatening situations. A permit holder is expected to exercise sound judgment and restraint. The Iowa Code, specifically regarding the use of force, emphasizes that force is only justified when necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily injury. Simply feeling uncomfortable or observing a minor infraction does not meet this threshold. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately displaying a firearm when feeling uneasy or observing a minor infraction. This action escalates a potentially non-violent situation, creates fear, and could be interpreted as a threat, violating the principle of using force only when necessary for self-defense. Iowa law does not permit the brandishing of a firearm as a means of intimidation or to resolve minor disputes. Another incorrect approach is to confront individuals engaging in minor rule breaking, such as loitering or littering, with the intent to enforce rules personally. While such behavior might be undesirable, it does not typically constitute an imminent threat requiring the intervention of a permit holder with a firearm. This approach oversteps the bounds of a permit holder's rights and responsibilities, potentially leading to a dangerous confrontation. A third incorrect approach is to assume that because one possesses a permit to carry, they are authorized to intervene in any situation they deem problematic, regardless of personal danger or legal justification. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the permit's purpose, which is for lawful self-defense, not for general law enforcement or dispute resolution. Iowa law requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger to justify the use of deadly force. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Iowa who are permitted to carry a handgun should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation. This framework involves 1. Observing and assessing the environment for potential threats. 2. If a potential threat is identified, determining if it poses an imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. 3. If no imminent danger exists, prioritizing avoidance and de-escalation. 4. If an imminent danger is present and unavoidable, acting within the strict legal parameters of self-defense as defined by Iowa law, which includes the use of necessary force. This systematic approach ensures responsible firearm carriage and adherence to legal and ethical obligations. Question 3. The control framework reveals that an individual in Iowa is seeking to obtain a permit to carry weapons. Which of the following actions best demonstrates a responsible and legally compliant approach to this process? Option A. Submitting an application with incomplete personal history information, believing that minor omissions will not be noticed. Option B. Relying on advice from friends who have previously obtained permits in other states, assuming the requirements are similar. Option C. Thoroughly reviewing the relevant sections of the Iowa Code, specifically Chapter 724, and consulting official state resources to understand all eligibility criteria, training requirements, and prohibited carrying locations before submitting an application. Option D. Assuming that since they own a firearm legally, they are automatically permitted to carry it concealed anywhere in Iowa without further steps. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly reviewing the relevant sections of the Iowa Code, specifically Chapter 724, and consulting official state resources to understand all eligibility criteria, training requirements, and prohibited carrying locations before submitting an application. Explanation. The control framework reveals that navigating the complexities of permit to carry weapons in Iowa requires a thorough understanding of legal requirements and responsible decision-making. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing an individual's right to self-defense with the state's interest in public safety, necessitating careful judgment to avoid legal repercussions and ethical missteps. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all applicable Iowa statutes and administrative rules pertaining to the permit to carry weapons. This includes understanding eligibility criteria, prohibited locations, and the responsibilities of a permit holder. Specifically, Iowa Code Chapter 724 outlines the requirements for obtaining and maintaining a permit, including the necessity of demonstrating good moral character and completing a firearms safety training course. Adhering strictly to these legal mandates ensures that the applicant meets all statutory obligations, thereby maximizing the likelihood of a successful and lawful permit application. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework established by the state of Iowa, prioritizing compliance and responsible firearm ownership as mandated by law. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal information or the advice of individuals who may not be fully versed in Iowa's specific firearm laws. This could lead to misinterpretations of eligibility requirements or overlooked training mandates, potentially resulting in a denied application or, worse, a violation of the law. Such an approach fails to engage with the authoritative legal sources, creating a significant risk of noncompliance. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that possessing a firearm automatically grants the right to carry it openly or concealed without a permit, or to disregard the specific restrictions on where a permit holder may carry a weapon. Iowa law, as detailed in Iowa Code Chapter 724, clearly delineates the process for obtaining a permit and the places where carrying a concealed weapon is prohibited, even with a permit. Failing to acknowledge these specific prohibitions demonstrates a lack of understanding of the law and a disregard for public safety regulations. A further incorrect approach would be to submit an application without truthfully and completely disclosing all required information, or to attempt to circumvent the background check process. Iowa Code Section 724:15 mandates that applicants provide truthful information and undergo a background investigation. Any attempt to mislead or obstruct this process is a direct violation of the law and will result in disqualification. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the governing jurisdiction and its specific laws, in this case, Iowa Code Chapter 724 and related administrative rules. Second, consult authoritative sources for accurate information, such as the Iowa Department of Public Safety or legal statutes. Third, meticulously review all eligibility requirements, training mandates, and restrictions. Fourth, ensure all application materials are accurate, complete, and truthful. Finally, understand the ongoing responsibilities and limitations associated with carrying a firearm. Question 4. System analysis indicates that an individual in Des Moines, Iowa, who possesses a valid permit to carry a concealed weapon, is walking through a crowded park. They observe another individual approaching them rapidly, shouting aggressively, and making gestures that could be interpreted as threatening. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the permit holder, considering Iowa's legal framework for carrying and using firearms? Option A. Ignore the approaching individual, as the permit to carry allows for carrying the weapon without needing to engage with potential threats. Option B. Immediately draw their concealed firearm and aim it at the approaching individual to deter them. Option C. Assume the aggressive shouting and gestures constitute a direct threat and immediately discharge their firearm to neutralize the perceived danger. Option D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and if such a threat is present, prepare to defend themselves while continuing to seek opportunities for de-escalation or escape. The correct answer is D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and if such a threat is present, prepare to defend themselves while continuing to seek opportunities for de-escalation or escape. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Iowa. The core of the challenge lies in making a split-second decision under duress, where the interpretation of a reasonable threat can have significant legal and ethical ramifications. The individual must consider not only their immediate safety, but also the potential consequences of their actions under Iowa law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalation and avoidance whenever safely possible, resorting to the use of a firearm only as a last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. This approach aligns with Iowa Code Section 724.4, which outlines the conditions under which carrying a concealed weapon is permissible, emphasizing that the weapon is for defense against immediate danger. Prioritizing de-escalation and avoidance demonstrates a commitment to responsible gun ownership and minimizes the risk of unnecessary violence, legal entanglements, and harm to oneself or others. It reflects a mature understanding of the gravity of carrying a weapon and the legal framework governing its use. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately drawing the firearm upon perceiving any perceived slight or annoyance, even if there is no immediate threat of physical harm. This fails to adhere to the principle of proportionality and the legal standard for justifiable use of force in Iowa. Such an action could be construed as aggressive rather than defensive, potentially violating Iowa Code Section 704.1 regarding the use of force in self-defense, which requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that a permit to carry has been obtained as justification for any use of the firearm. A permit grants the legal right to carry, but it does not grant carte blanche to use the weapon indiscriminately. The permit holder remains bound by the laws governing the use of force, including the requirement of a reasonable and imminent threat. Failing to recognize this distinction ignores the critical legal and ethical responsibilities that accompany carrying a concealed weapon. A further incorrect approach involves attempting to verbally intimidate or threaten an individual with a firearm without any immediate physical threat. This constitutes brandishing a weapon, which is a separate criminal offense in Iowa and is not a legally justifiable use of force for self-defense. It escalates a situation unnecessarily and can lead to severe legal penalties, irrespective of whether a permit to carry is held. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Iowa who are permitted to carry a concealed weapon should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, de-escalation, and adherence to legal statutes. This framework involves 1. Situational awareness to identify potential threats early. 2. A commitment to de-escalation tactics whenever feasible and safe. 3. A clear understanding of the legal definition of imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury as outlined in Iowa law. 4. The principle of last resort, meaning the firearm is only to be used when all other safe options have been exhausted and the threat is immediate and severe. 5. Continuous training and education on firearm safety, legal responsibilities, and defensive tactics. Question 5. System analysis indicates that while carrying a concealed weapon legally in Iowa, you observe two individuals in a public park exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior, speaking loudly, and gesturing aggressively towards each other, though not directly at you. They are approximately 20 yards away. What is the most prudent and legally sound course of action? Option A. Approach the individuals directly and attempt to mediate their dispute, explaining that their behavior is disruptive. Option B. Discreetly increase your awareness of your surroundings. Assess if the situation is escalating towards a direct threat to yourself or others, and be prepared to disengage or seek a safe distance if necessary, without drawing attention to your concealed weapon. Option C. Immediately draw your concealed weapon and verbally command the individuals to calm down and disperse, asserting your authority as a permit holder. Option D. Continue your current activity without acknowledging the individuals, assuming their behavior is not a direct threat to you. The correct answer is B. Discreetly increase your awareness of your surroundings. Assess if the situation is escalating towards a direct threat to yourself or others, and be prepared to disengage or seek a safe distance if necessary, without drawing attention to your concealed weapon. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to assess a situation involving a potential threat and determine the appropriate course of action while adhering to Iowa's specific legal framework for carrying weapons. The challenge lies in balancing the right to self-defense with the legal obligations and ethical considerations surrounding the use of a firearm. Misjudgment could lead to legal repercussion, endanger oneself or others, or violate the spirit of the Iowa permit to carry weapons regulations. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between a genuine threat necessitating defensive action and a situation that does not meet the legal threshold for the use of deadly force. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever safely possible, while remaining aware of the surroundings and preparing to act only if legally justified. This approach prioritizes personal safety and the safety of others by seeking to disengage from a potentially volatile situation. It aligns with the principles of responsible firearm ownership and the legal standards in Iowa, which generally require an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to justify the use of deadly force. The Iowa Code, specifically concerning self-defense and the use of force, emphasizes that force is justified only when necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury. This approach seeks to avoid reaching the point where such force would be legally permissible. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately drawing a concealed weapon and confronting the individuals, assuming a threat based on their behavior. This fails to meet the legal standard of imminent threat required by Iowa law for the use of deadly force. Drawing a weapon without a clear and present danger can escalate the situation unnecessarily and may be viewed as an aggressive act, potentially leading to legal consequences for the permit holder. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the situation entirely and continue as if nothing is happening, even if the individual's behavior is becoming increasingly aggressive and potentially threatening. While avoidance is generally preferred, completely disregarding a developing threat that could reasonably escalate to imminent danger would be a failure to exercise due diligence in ensuring personal safety, which is a fundamental aspect of responsible permit to carry. A further incorrect approach is to verbally confront the individuals aggressively and demand they leave the area. While communication can be a de-escalation tool, an aggressive verbal confrontation, especially when combined with the knowledge of carrying a concealed weapon, can be perceived as provocative and may escalate the situation into a physical confrontation, thereby increasing the risk of harm and potentially violating the principles of responsible and lawful firearm carry. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation. This involves observing the environment, identifying potential risks, and evaluating the intent and capabilities of individuals exhibiting concerning behavior. The primary goal should be to avoid confrontation. If a situation appears to be escalating towards a credible threat of imminent death or serious bodily injury, the individual should assess whether retreat is possible. Only when retreat is not feasible and the threat is immediate and severe should the use of force, including a firearm, be considered, strictly within the legal parameters defined by Iowa law. This framework emphasizes a graduated response, moving from passive observation to active avoidance, and only as a last resort to defensive action. Question 6. Which approach would be most appropriate for an Iowa law enforcement officer to take when observing an individual openly carrying a handgun in a manner that appears lawful but without immediate indication of threat? Option A. Make an assumption about the individual's intent based on their appearance and decide whether to engage further. Option B. Ignore the presence of the handgun and continue with other duties. Option C. Calmly and respectfully ask to see the individual's permit to carry weapons and inquire about the reason for carrying the firearm. Option D. Immediately demand the individual surrender the handgun, assuming a potential threat. The correct answer is C. Calmly and respectfully ask to see the individual's permit to carry weapons and inquire about the reason for carrying the firearm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a potential conflict between a citizen's right to carry a firearm and the responsibility to ensure public safety. The individual's stated intent to carry a weapon for self-defense, while generally permissible under Iowa law for permit holders, requires careful consideration of the circumstances and the permit holder's understanding of their legal obligations. The challenge lies in assessing whether the individual's actions and intentions align with the responsible and lawful exercise of their permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a direct, calm, and respectful inquiry into the individual's permit status and the reason for carrying the weapon. This approach aligns with Iowa Code Chapter 724, which governs the carrying of weapons. Specifically, Iowa Code Section 724.4 outlines the conditions under which a person may carry a handgun, including possessing a valid permit. By asking to see the permit and inquiring about the reason for carrying, law enforcement is gathering information to determine if the individual is acting within the bounds of the law. This is a proactive measure to ensure compliance and public safety without making assumptions. It respects the individual's rights while fulfilling the officer's duty to enforce the law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately assume the individual is acting unlawfully and to demand the weapon be surrendered without further inquiry. This fails to acknowledge the legal right to carry a weapon with a permit and could escalate a situation unnecessarily. It bypasses the crucial step of verifying the permit and understanding the context. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the presence of the weapon and proceed as if no firearm is being carried. This is a failure of duty to ensure public safety and to enforce the laws of Iowa. Law enforcement officers have a responsibility to be aware of and address potential threats or violations of the law, and ignoring a visible firearm would be a dereliction of that duty. A further incorrect approach would be to make a judgment based solely on the individual's appearance or demeanor without any factual basis. Iowa law does not permit profiling or making assumptions about an individual's intent or legality based on subjective characteristics. The focus must remain on observable action and legal status. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a framework that prioritizes information gathering, de-escalation, and adherence to legal statutes. This involves approaching the situation with a calm and objective demeanor, seeking to understand the facts before taking action. The decision-making process should be guided by the specific provisions of Iowa Code Chapter 724, focusing on verifying legal authority to carry and understanding the immediate circumstances. This systematic approach ensures that actions are lawful, proportionate, and contribute to maintaining public safety while respecting individual rights. Question 7. Investigation of a situation in Iowa where an individual carrying a permit to carry weapons observes another person in a public park who is behaving erratically and appears to be under the influence of substances, causing the permit holder discomfort but not posing a direct physical threat. The permit holder is considering how to respond. Which of the following actions best aligns with Iowa's legal framework for permit holders? Option A. Immediately approach the individual and demand they leave the park due to their unsettling behavior. Option B. Continue with personal activities without any observation or assessment of the individual's behavior. Option C. Draw the firearm and issue a verbal warning to the individual to deter them from approaching. Option D. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct confrontation, and only consider action if the individual poses a direct, imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. The correct answer is D. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct confrontation, and only consider action if the individual poses a direct, imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a firearm in public. The individual is in a situation where their perception of a threat might not align with objective reality, and a misjudgment could have severe legal and ethical consequences. The core challenge lies in discerning a genuine, immediate threat from a situation that merely causes discomfort or unease, adhering strictly to Iowa's legal standards for the use of deadly force. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever possible, while remaining aware of surroundings and prepared to act only if a direct, imminent threat to life or serious bodily injury is present. This aligns with Iowa Code Section 704.1, which outlines the justifiable use of force. Specifically, the law permits the use of force, including deadly force, when a person reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent imminent death, serious injury, or the commission of a forcible felony. The correct approach prioritizes avoiding the escalation of a situation that does not meet these strict legal criteria for self-defense. It emphasizes situational awareness and a commitment to lawful conduct, recognizing that the mere presence of an individual who appears suspicious or unsettling does not, in itself, constitute an imminent threat, justifying a preemptive aggressive action or confrontation. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves confronting the individual directly and demanding they leave the area. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it constitutes an aggressive action that is not legally justified under Iowa law. Confrontation, especially when initiated by the permit holder, can escalate a situation and potentially lead to the permit holder being perceived as the aggressor, negating any claim of self-defense. It bypasses the legal requirement for an imminent threat and instead creates one. Another incorrect approach is to immediately draw the firearm and issue a verbal warning. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Drawing a firearm is a serious act that implies an immediate threat and can provoke panic or an aggressive response from the other individual, even if no such threat existed prior. Iowa law does not permit the brandishing of a firearm as a means of intimidation or to resolve perceived discomfort. Such an action could be construed as assault or a violation of public order, and it fails to meet the stringent requirements for the justifiable use of deadly force. A further incorrect approach is to ignore the individual completely and continue with one's activities without any regard for the perceived situation. While avoidance is generally good, complete disregard, without any assessment of potential risk, is not ideal. This approach fails to acknowledge the importance of situational awareness, which is a crucial component of responsible firearm carry. While not as egregious as the other incorrect approaches, it misses an opportunity to assess, and if necessary, lawfully respond to a genuine threat, and it does not fully embrace the proactive responsibility that comes with carrying a permit. Professional reasoning. Professionals carrying a permit to carry weapons in Iowa should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes lawful conduct, de-escalation, and a clear understanding of the legal thresholds for self-defense. This framework involves 1. Maintaining situational awareness to identify potential threats. 2. Assessing whether any perceived threat meets the legal definition of imminent danger to life or serious bodily injury as defined by Iowa Code Section 704. 1. 3. Prioritizing avoidance and de-escalation strategies. 4. Only resorting to the use of force, and specifically deadly force, as a last resort when all other lawful options have been exhausted and the legal criteria are unequivocally met. This systematic approach ensures that actions are both legally defensible and ethically sound, safeguarding both the individual and the public. Question 8. Assessment of a situation in Des Moines, Iowa, where an individual with a valid permit to carry weapons observes a heated verbal argument escalating in a public park, with one individual appearing increasingly agitated and reaching into their jacket. What is the most prudent course of action for the permit holder, adhering strictly to Iowa's legal framework for firearm possession and use? Option A. Immediately draw the firearm to deter potential aggression and ensure personal safety. Option B. Ignore the situation entirely, as the permit only allows for carrying a weapon and does not obligate intervention. Option C. Rely on the permit to carry weapons as justification to intervene verbally and physically if the situation seems to warrant it. Option D. Calmly assess the immediate threat level, considering if there is an imminent danger of death or serious injury, while remaining aware of legal justifications for the use of force in Iowa. The correct answer is D. Calmly assess the immediate threat level, considering if there is an imminent danger of death or serious injury, while remaining aware of legal justifications for the use of force in Iowa. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to make a critical decision under pressure, balancing personal safety with legal obligations and responsible firearm handling. The core difficulty lies in interpreting the nuances of Iowa's permit to carry weapons law when faced with a rapidly evolving, potentially threatening situation. A hasty or ill-informed decision could have severe legal repercussions or compromise personal safety. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a calm, objective assessment of the immediate threat level and a clear understanding of the legal parameters for using deadly force in Iowa. This means recognizing that a permit to carry does not grant carte blanche to use a firearm in any situation. Instead, it permits carrying a handgun under specific circumstances, and the use of deadly force is governed by Iowa Code Chapter 704, which outlines justifiable use of force. The correct response prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation if possible, while being prepared to act decisively and legally if an imminent threat to life or serious injury is present. This aligns with the principle of using only the force necessary to repel the threat, as defined by Iowa law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately draw the firearm upon perceiving a potential threat, without a thorough assessment of the immediate danger. This fails to adhere to the legal standard for justifiable use of force in Iowa, which requires a reasonable belief that such force is necessary to prevent death or serious injury. Drawing a weapon prematurely could escalate a situation unnecessarily and lead to legal consequences if no imminent threat is established. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the permit to carry as justification for any action taken. A permit to carry is distinct from the legal justification for using deadly force. The permit allows for the carrying of a firearm, but the decision to use it, especially in a manner that could result in harm, must be grounded in the principles of self-defense as defined by Iowa law. This approach ignores the critical legal distinction between carrying and using a firearm. A third incorrect approach is to hesitate or freeze, failing to take any action when faced with a clear and present danger. While de-escalation is preferred, inaction in the face of an imminent threat to life or serious injury could be as detrimental as an overreaction. Iowa law permits the use of force, including deadly force, to protect oneself or others from such threats, and a failure to act when legally justified could have tragic consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and legal compliance. This involves 1. Maintaining a calm demeanor to facilitate clear thinking. 2. Actively observing the environment and individuals involved to identify potential threats. 3. Evaluating the imminence and severity of any perceived threat against the legal standards for self-defense in Iowa. 4. Considering all available options, including de-escalation, retreat, and the legal use of force, in that order of preference where feasible. 5. Acting decisively and within the bounds of the law if force becomes necessary. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates a situation where an individual, legally permitted to carry a concealed weapon in Iowa, is experiencing a verbal altercation in a public parking lot with another person who is exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior and making aggressive gestures, but has not yet made any physical contact or direct threats of immediate physical harm. The permit holder feels increasingly uncomfortable and concerned about their safety. Considering Iowa's legal framework for carrying weapons, what is the most prudent and legally sound course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Immediately draw their firearm and prepare to use it if the individual makes any further aggressive movements, even if no immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury is present. Option B. Draw their firearm and point it at the individual to deter further aggressive behavior and assert their right to feel safe. Option C. Engage in a verbal counterargument to match the intensity of the other individual's agitation, aiming to assert dominance and end the confrontation. Option D. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally, create distance by moving away from the individual, and if necessary, retreat to a secure location or call law enforcement for assistance, without displaying or drawing their firearm. The correct answer is D. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally, create distance by moving away from the individual, and if necessary, retreat to a secure location or call law enforcement for assistance, without displaying or drawing their firearm. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Iowa. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and applying Iowa Code Chapter 724, specifically concerning the lawful use of force and the conditions under which a permit to carry is valid, while also considering the ethical implications of potential escalation. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be misconstrued as aggressive or unnecessary, thereby jeopardizing the permit holder's legal standing and safety. The best approach involves de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation, prioritizing personal safety and adherence to legal mandates. This means recognizing that the presence of a firearm, even when legally carried, does not grant permission to engage in aggressive behavior or to use the weapon as a tool for intimidation. Instead, the permit holder should focus on creating distance, seeking a safe environment, and only resorting to the use of force as a last resort when facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, as defined by Iowa law. This aligns with the principle that a permit to carry is for defensive purposes, not offensive action. An incorrect approach involves displaying the firearm or making overt gestures with it to intimidate or assert dominance in a non-threatening situation. This action is problematic because it can be interpreted as an unlawful threat or brandishing, potentially violating Iowa Code 724-32, which prohibits the exhibition of a firearm in a threatening manner. Furthermore, it escalates a situation unnecessarily, increasing the risk of a negative outcome and potentially leading to criminal charges, even if no physical harm occurs. Another incorrect approach is to engage verbally or physically with the individual exhibiting aggressive behavior, thereby escalating the confrontation. This fails to recognize the primary objective of carrying a concealed weapon, which is to protect oneself from serious harm. Engaging in a verbal or physical altercation, especially when one is armed, significantly increases the likelihood of the situation deteriorating into a violent encounter where the permit holder might be forced to use their weapon, potentially in a manner that is not legally justifiable under Iowa Code 724. 4. This approach prioritizes ego, or a perceived need, to win an argument over personal safety and legal compliance. A final incorrect approach is to immediately draw the firearm and point it at the individual without a clear and present danger of imminent death or serious bodily injury. This constitutes an unlawful use of force under Iowa law, as the permit to carry does not authorize preemptive or retaliatory actions. Iowa Code 724-4 outlines the justifiable use of force, which is strictly tied to preventing death or serious bodily injury. Drawing a weapon without such imminent threat can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges for assault or other related offenses. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rapid assessment of the threat level, prioritizing personal safety through avoidance and de-escalation. If a threat is perceived, the permit holder should assess if it meets the legal threshold for imminent death or serious bodily injury. If it does, they should consider the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. If the situation does not meet this threshold, the focus should remain on disengagement and seeking a safe distance or assistance from law enforcement. Understanding the nuances of Iowa Code Chapter 724, particularly regarding justifiable use of force and unlawful exhibition of a firearm, is paramount. Question 10. Market research demonstrates that many Iowans seeking to obtain a permit to carry weapons are also concerned about the secure storage of their firearms when not in use. A resident in Des Moines, Iowa, has purchased a new gun safe with internal dimensions of 60 inches in height, 30 inches in width, and 20 inches in depth. They own 5 handguns, each with an average volume of approximately 800 cubic inches, and 2 rifles, each with an average volume of approximately 500 cubic inches. Assuming that firearms can be packed efficiently but without damage, what is the maximum number of firearms, handguns and rifles combined, that can be securely stored in this safe, and what is the most appropriate method for determining this number? Option A. Store all 7 firearms, even if it requires some forcing to close the safe door completely, as the primary concern is having them accessible for permit holders. Option B. Divide the safe's internal volume by a generic average firearm volume of 500 cubic inches to determine capacity. /36000/1, 500 equals 24 firearms. Therefore, the safe can store up to 24 firearms. Option C. Calculate the total internal volume of the safe and divide it by the average volume of each firearm, accounting for the different types of firearms. The safe's volume is /60 times 30 times 20 equals 36,000 cubic inches. The total volume occupied by the handguns is /5 times 800 equals 4,000 cubic inches, and the total volume occupied by the rifles is /2 times 2, 500 equals 5,000 cubic inches. The total volume for all firearms is /4,000 plus 5,000 equals 9,000 cubic inches. Therefore, the safe can securely store a maximum of 9,000 cubic inches of firearms, which is well within its capacity. The maximum number of firearms that can be stored is 7, as all currently owned firearms fit comfortably. Option D. Rely on the gun safe manufacturer's stated capacity, which is listed as holding 20 long guns and 10 handguns, for a total of 30 firearms. The correct answer is C. Calculate the total internal volume of the safe and divide it by the average volume of each firearm, accounting for the different types of firearms. The safe's volume is /60 times 30 times 20 equals 36,000 cubic inches. The total volume occupied by the handguns is 5 times 800 equals 4,000 cubic inches, and the total volume occupied by the rifles is 2 times 2, 500 equals 5,000 cubic inches. The total volume for all firearms is 4,000 plus 5,000 equals 9,000 cubic inches. Therefore, the safe can securely store a maximum of 9,000 cubic inches of firearms, which is well within its capacity. The maximum number of firearms that can be stored is 7, as all currently owned firearms fit comfortably. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the responsible handling and storage of firearms, specifically concerning the calculation of storage capacity and compliance with Iowa's legal requirements for secure firearm storage. The challenge lies in accurately determining the number of firearms that can be stored in a safe of a given internal volume, considering the physical dimensions of the firearms and the safe's capacity, while adhering to the spirit of preventing unauthorized access. Miscalculation could lead to unsafe storage practices or noncompliance with implied safety standards, even if not explicitly codified as a numerical limit in Iowa's permit to carry statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves calculating the maximum number of firearms that can physically fit within the safe's internal dimensions, ensuring each firearm can be stored securely and without undue pressure that could compromise its integrity or the safe's functionality. This requires measuring the internal dimensions of the safe and estimating the average volume occupied by a firearm, then dividing the safe's volume by the firearm's volume. For example, if the safe's internal dimensions are 60 inches height, x 30 inches width, x 20 inches depth, its total internal volume is 60 times 30 times 20 equals 36,000 cubic inches. If the average firearm occupies approximately 1,000 cubic inches, considering length, width, and height, including any accessories or padding, the maximum number of firearms that can be stored is 36,000/1,000 equals 36 /. This approach prioritizes practical, safe, and secure storage within the physical constraints of the safe, aligning with the general intent of firearm safety regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply divide the safe's internal volume by a generic, standard firearm volume, without considering the specific types and sizes of firearms being stored. This fails to account for variations in firearm dimensions, potentially leading to overcrowding, damage to firearms, or the inability to properly secure them. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the manufacturer's stated capacity for the safe, as this may not always reflect the actual number of firearms of varying sizes that can be stored securely. Manufacturers' ratings can sometimes be optimistic or based on specific firearm configurations. A third incorrect approach is to store firearms in a manner that exceeds the safe's physical capacity, even if it means forcing them in or leaving the safe door slightly ajar. This directly compromises the security and safety of the firearms, violating the fundamental purpose of a gun safe and potentially creating an unauthorized access risk. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach firearm storage by prioritizing safety, security, and compliance. This involves a practical assessment of physical space and the dimensions of the items to be stored. A systematic calculation based on actual measurements, rather than assumptions or generic guidelines, ensures that storage solutions are both effective and compliant with the underlying principles of responsible firearm ownership. When in doubt, erring on the side of caution and ensuring ample space for secure storage is always the most prudent course of action. Question 11. Market research demonstrates that individuals seeking to obtain an Iowa permit to carry weapons are often concerned about how to react in potentially confrontational situations. Consider a scenario where an individual with a valid Iowa permit to carry weapons is in a public place, and a stranger aggressively confronts them, verbally abusing them and invading their personal space, but without making any physical threats or displaying any weapons. What is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Engage in a verbal argument with the aggressor to assert their rights and defend their personal space. Option B. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally and create distance if possible without displaying the firearm. Option C. Assume the aggressive behavior constitutes an imminent threat and prepare to use the firearm if the situation does not immediately resolve. Option D. Immediately display the firearm to deter the aggressor and signal that they are armed. The correct answer is B. Attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally and create distance if possible, without displaying the firearm. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Iowa. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of Iowa's permit to carry weapons law, specifically regarding the circumstances under which force may be justified, and the importance of de-escalation. Careful judgment is required to avoid unnecessary escalation of a situation that could lead to legal repercussions or harm to oneself or others. The best professional approach involves prioritizing de-escalation and avoiding the display of a firearm, unless absolutely necessary for immediate self-defense against a credible threat of death or serious injury. This aligns with the principles of responsible firearm ownership and the legal framework in Iowa, which permits carrying a weapon for self-defense, but does not grant a license to use it proactively or in situations that can be resolved without resorting to force. The emphasis is on lawful self-preservation, not on asserting dominance or resolving disputes through intimidation. An approach that involves displaying the firearm to deter potential aggressors, even without an immediate threat of serious harm, is professionally unacceptable. This action could be interpreted as an aggressive act, potentially escalating the situation and leading to a charge of assault with a deadly weapon or brandishing, depending on the specific circumstances and the interpretation of Iowa law. It fails to adhere to the principle of using force only as a last resort when facing an imminent danger. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that having a permit to carry automatically justifies the use of the firearm in any perceived confrontation. This demonstrates a misunderstanding of the legal standard for self-defense, which requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. The permit itself does not negate the need for this legal justification. Finally, an approach that involves engaging verbally with an aggressive individual in a manner that provokes further conflict, while carrying a concealed weapon, is also professionally unsound. While verbal de-escalation is often encouraged, doing so in a way that escalates the situation rather than diffusing it, especially when armed, increases the risk of a violent encounter and potential legal consequences. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a continuous assessment of the threat level, prioritizing de-escalation techniques, and understanding that the permit to carry is a privilege that carries significant responsibility. The fundamental principle is to avoid conflict whenever possible and to use deadly force only when there is no other reasonable alternative to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury. Question 12. The audit findings indicate that a permit to carry weapons holder in Des Moines, Iowa, was found to have a handgun in the glove compartment of their vehicle while parked in a public parking lot. The permit holder stated they were not actively carrying the weapon on their person at that moment. Based on Iowa law, which of the following represents the most appropriate initial response to this finding? Option A. Advise the permit holder that possessing a firearm in a vehicle, even when not on their person, is a violation of their permit and recommend they surrender their permit. Option B. Review the specific provisions of Iowa Code Chapter 724 concerning the carrying and storage of handguns by permit holders in vehicles, and assess whether the glove compartment constitutes a lawful storage location under the circumstances. Option C. Assume the auditor's finding is a minor administrative issue and require no further investigation beyond noting the observation. Option D. Immediately conclude that the permit holder violated the terms of their permit, as any firearm in a vehicle requires active carrying by a permit holder. Correct answer is B. Review the specific provisions of Iowa Code Chapter 724 concerning the carrying and storage of handguns by permit holders in vehicles, and assess whether the glove compartment constitutes a lawful storage location under the circumstances. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential lapse in adherence to Iowa's permit to carry weapons regulations, specifically concerning the proper storage and handling of a firearm by a permit holder. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of Iowa law, which prioritizes public safety and responsible firearm ownership, while also acknowledging the rights of permit holders. The auditor's concern highlights the critical need for permit holders to be acutely aware of their responsibilities beyond simply possessing a permit. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the specific circumstances against the Iowa Code provisions governing the carrying and storage of firearms by permit holders. This includes understanding the nuances of carrying versus storing a weapon and the legal requirements for each. Iowa law, as outlined in Chapter 724 of the Iowa Code, mandates that permit to carry is required to carry a handgun in public places. However, it also specifies conditions under which a firearm may be possessed and stored, even by a permit holder, in certain locations. The auditor's finding suggests a potential misinterpretation or misapplication of these rules, necessitating a careful examination of whether the firearm was indeed being carried in a manner that violated the permit's conditions, or if it was lawfully stored. The best professional practice is to consult the relevant sections of the Iowa Code, specifically those pertaining to carrying weapons and the exceptions or conditions related to storage, to determine if the permit holder's actions were compliant. This ensures that any action taken is grounded in the specific legal framework of Iowa. An incorrect approach would be to assume that any firearm found in a vehicle, regardless of its condition or the permit holder's intent, automatically constitutes a violation of the permit to carry. This overlooks the legal distinctions between carrying and storing a firearm, and the specific provisions within Iowa law that may permit a firearm to be stored in a vehicle under certain conditions, even by a permit holder. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general assumptions about firearm safety without referencing the specific legal requirements of Iowa. This could lead to an overzealous or insufficient response that does not align with the established legal standards. Finally, an approach that dismisses the auditor's concern without a proper investigation into the specific Iowa Code provisions related to permit holders and firearm storage in vehicles would be professionally negligent. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific allegations or findings. This should be followed by a meticulous review of the applicable laws and regulations of the relevant jurisdiction, in this case, Iowa Code Chapter 724. The facts of the situation must then be carefully compared against these legal requirements. If ambiguity exists, seeking clarification from legal counsel or relevant authorities is paramount. The ultimate goal is to ensure actions are compliant with the law and uphold the principles of responsible firearm ownership and public safety. Question 13. Market research demonstrates that applicants for a permit to carry weapons in Iowa may have diverse personal histories. An applicant submits an application that includes a detailed personal history section. In this section, the applicant mentions a past domestic dispute that was ultimately dismissed by the court. The applicant also provides a letter from a former employer stating they are a responsible individual. Considering the requirements of Iowa Code Chapter 724, what is the most appropriate course of action for the issuing authority? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of all submitted documentation, including the details of the dismissed domestic dispute and the employer's letter, to determine if any statutory disqualifications under Iowa Code Chapter 724 are met. Option B. Base the decision solely on the applicant's perceived demeanor during any potential in-person interaction, as this is the best indicator of their suitability. Option C. Issue the permit without further investigation, assuming that a dismissed dispute and a positive employer letter are sufficient to meet all requirements. Option D. Immediately deny the permit application upon seeing the mention of a domestic dispute, regardless of its dismissal status. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of all submitted documentation, including the details of the dismissed domestic dispute and the employer's letter, to determine if any statutory disqualifications under Iowa Code Chapter 724 are met. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between an individual's right to self-defense and the state's interest in public safety, as codified in Iowa law. The applicant's past behavior, even if not resulting in a criminal conviction, raises concerns about their temperament and judgment, which are critical factors in determining suitability for carrying a concealed weapon. Careful consideration of all provided information is paramount to ensure compliance with Iowa Code Chapter 724. The best approach involves a thorough and objective review of all submitted documentation, including the applicant's personal history and any supporting evidence they have provided. This approach prioritizes adherence to the statutory requirements for a permit to carry weapons in Iowa. Specifically, Iowa Code Section 724(7) outlines the criteria for disqualification, which includes convictions for certain crimes and findings of being a danger to themselves or others. While the applicant has no convictions, the information regarding the domestic dispute, even if dismissed, could be relevant to assessing whether they pose a danger. A comprehensive review allows for an informed decision based on the totality of the circumstances, ensuring that the permit is only issued to individuals who meet all legal qualifications and do not present an undue risk. This aligns with the ethical obligation to uphold public safety while respecting individual rights, an approach that immediately denies the permit based solely on the mention of a domestic dispute, without a thorough review of the dismissal details and any other supporting information, is procedurally flawed. Iowa law does not automatically disqualify an applicant for any mention of a past dispute. Rather, it focuses on specific disqualifying factors. Failing to conduct a complete review risks an arbitrary decision that may not be legally defensible. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the permit without any further inquiry, assuming that a dismissed dispute means no issue. This overlooks the potential for the incident, even if not leading to a conviction, to indicate a pattern of behavior or a lack of judgment that could be relevant to public safety. It fails to exercise due diligence in assessing the applicant's suitability as required by the spirit and letter of Iowa's firearms regulations. Finally, an approach that relies on personal feelings or assumptions about the applicant's character, rather than objective evidence and legal criteria, is unprofessional and violates the principles of fair and impartial decision-making. The decision must be grounded in the specific provisions of Iowa Code, Chapter 724. Professionals in this role should employ a systematic decision-making process. 1. Understand and meticulously apply all relevant statutory requirements. Iowa Code, Chapter 724. 2. Objectively review all submitted documentation, giving due weight to both the applicant's history and any mitigating or exacerbating factors presented. 3. Identify any potential disqualifying factors as defined by law. 4. If potential disqualifying factors are present, conduct further necessary inquiries or request additional information to make a fully informed decision. 5. Document the decision-making process and the rationale for the final determination, ensuring it is based on factual evidence and legal standards. Question 14. Compliance review shows that an individual holding a valid Iowa permit to carry weapons is attending a private business seminar hosted at a local community center. The community center has no signage indicating a prohibition of firearms, and the seminar is open to the public for registration. The individual is aware that the community center is a municipal building. Considering Iowa Code Chapter 724, what is the most prudent course of action regarding carrying a concealed weapon? Option A. Carry the concealed weapon, assuming that the private seminar overrides any general restrictions that might apply to the community center as a municipal building. Option B. Carry the concealed weapon but remain discreet and avoid drawing attention to it, as the primary purpose of the location is for a private event. Option C. Carry the concealed weapon, as the seminar is open to the public and there is no explicit prohibition signage at the community center. Option D. Do not carry the concealed weapon, as municipal buildings are generally considered prohibited locations for carrying firearms under Iowa law, regardless of specific event signage. The correct answer is C. Carry the concealed weapon, as the seminar is open to the public and there is no explicit prohibition signage at the community center. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Iowa's permit to carry weapons law, specifically concerning the permissible locations for carrying a concealed weapon. The challenge lies in interpreting the statute's exceptions and applying them to a real-world situation where ambiguity might arise. Careful judgment is required to avoid violating the law, which could have serious legal consequences. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding of Iowa Code Section 724(4), which outlines prohibited places for carrying weapons. This approach prioritizes adherence to the letter of the law by recognizing that a private establishment, even if open to the public, does not automatically fall under an exception that permits carrying a concealed weapon if the establishment itself prohibits firearms. The individual must ascertain the establishment's specific policy and if firearms are prohibited, refrain from carrying the weapon in that location. This aligns with the ethical responsibility to respect private property rights and the legal mandate to comply with firearm regulations. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because a business is open to the public, the prohibition on carrying weapons in certain public places does not apply. Iowa Code Section 724.4.4 specifically prohibits carrying in a private club or lawfully possessed by a private club. While not a private club, the principle of respecting private property rights and posted prohibitions is paramount. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the absence of explicit signage prohibiting firearms. Iowa law does not require signage to enforce prohibitions. The prohibition exists by statute and can be enforced by the property owner or establishment. A third incorrect approach would be to interpret public place too broadly, believing that any establishment accessible to the public is inherently permitted for carrying. The law carves out specific exceptions, and a private establishment's right to prohibit firearms is not overridden by general public access. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant legal framework. Iowa Code, Chapter 724. Next, they must analyze the specific circumstances against the statutory provisions, paying close attention to definitions and exceptions. When in doubt, seeking clarification from legal counsel or relevant authorities is a prudent step. The guiding principle should always be to err on the side of caution and strict compliance with the law. Question 15. Market research demonstrates that applicants for a permit to carry weapons in Iowa may have varied backgrounds. An applicant for a permit to carry weapons in Iowa has a history that includes a documented domestic disturbance call from 5 years ago, for which no charges were filed. The applicant has no criminal convictions. During the application process, the applicant appears calm and cooperative. Considering the requirements for obtaining a permit to carry weapons in Iowa, what is the most appropriate course of action for the issuing authority? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the circumstances surrounding the domestic disturbance call, alongside the applicant's overall history and current demeanor, to determine if there is any indication of a propensity for violence or poor judgment that would disqualify them under Iowa Code Chapter 724. Option B. Focus solely on whether the applicant has any disqualifying criminal convictions, and if none exist, issue the permit without further investigation into past incidents. Option C. Deny the permit based on the mere fact that a domestic disturbance call was documented, regardless of whether charges were filed or the applicant's current disposition. Option D. Issue the permit immediately, as the absence of criminal charges for the domestic disturbance and the applicant's current calm demeanor are sufficient to meet the permit requirements. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough review of the circumstances surrounding the domestic disturbance call, alongside the applicant's overall history and current demeanor, to determine if there is any indication of a propensity for violence or poor judgment that would disqualify them under Iowa Code Chapter 724. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between an individual's right to self-defense and the state's interest in public safety and responsible firearm ownership. The applicant's past behavior, while not resulting in a criminal conviction that would automatically disqualify them, raises concerns about their judgment and temperament, which are critical factors in determining suitability for a permit to carry a concealed weapon in Iowa. A thorough and objective assessment of all available information is paramount to ensure public safety without unduly infringing on lawful rights. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of the applicant's history, focusing on any documented instances of aggression, impulsivity, or disregard for the law, even if they did not lead to formal charges. This includes scrutinizing the details of the domestic disturbance call, even if no charges were filed. The goal is to ascertain if the applicant exhibits a pattern of behavior that suggests they might pose a risk to themselves or others if armed. This aligns with the spirit of Iowa Code Chapter 724, which aims to ensure that only individuals who are not a danger to themselves or others are granted permits to carry weapons. The decision must be based on a holistic evaluation of the applicant's character and past conduct as it relates to responsible firearm possession and use. An approach that dismisses the domestic disturbance call simply because no charges were filed is professionally unacceptable. While a lack of charges is a factor, It does not negate the potential for underlying issues of poor judgment or volatile behavior that could be exacerbated by carrying a firearm. This overlooks the investigative discretion of law enforcement and the possibility that the situation was resolved without charges for reasons unrelated to the applicant's conduct. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to deny the permit solely based on the applicant's perceived attitude during the application process, without concrete evidence of disqualifying behavior. Subjective impressions, while potentially noted, must be supported by objective facts and documented incidents to justify a denial under Iowa law. Personal biases or assumptions about the applicant's demeanor are not grounds for disqualification. Finally, an approach that focuses exclusively on whether the applicant has a disqualifying criminal conviction, ignoring any other relevant behavioral indicators, is also flawed. Iowa Code Chapter 724 outlines several grounds for denial beyond criminal convictions, including those related to mental health and a propensity for violence. A narrow interpretation that only considers formal convictions fails to adequately assess the applicant's overall suitability and potential risk. Professionals tasked with reviewing permit applications should employ a structured decision-making process that includes gathering all relevant information, objectively evaluating documented incidents against the criteria outlined in Iowa Code Chapter 724, considering the totality of the circumstances, and making a determination based on evidence rather than speculation or personal bias. This ensures a fair and consistent application of the law, prioritizing both individual rights and public safety. Question 16. What factors determine the justifiable use of deadly force for a permit holder in Iowa when confronted with an aggressive individual who is verbally threatening and physically posturing, but not yet making direct physical contact? Option A. The permit holder's subjective feeling of fear and the aggressor's aggressive verbal statements alone. Option B. The permit holder's reasonable belief, based on the totality of the circumstances, that there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and that the use of deadly force is necessary to repel the attack. Option C. The permit holder's desire to immediately end the confrontation by any means necessary to avoid further verbal or physical escalation. Option D. The permit holder's possession of a valid Iowa permit to carry weapons, which grants broad authority to use the weapon when feeling threatened. The correct answer is B. The permit holder's reasonable belief, based on the totality of the circumstances, that there is an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and that the use of deadly force is necessary to repel the attack. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Iowa. The core challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of reasonable force and understanding when the threat escalates to a level justifying the use of deadly force, all while remaining within the strict confines of Iowa Code Chapter 724. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and civil liability, even if the intent was self-preservation. Careful judgment is required to assess the totality of circumstances and act in accordance with the law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Iowa Code Chapter 724, specifically regarding the justifiable use of force. This approach emphasizes de-escalation whenever safely possible and using only the minimum force necessary to repel an unlawful attack. It requires an objective assessment of the threat, considering the aggressor's actions, words, and the surrounding environment to determine if there is an imminent danger of death or serious injury. The decision to use deadly force must be a last resort, undertaken only when all other reasonable means of escape or defense have been exhausted or are unavailable, and the threat is immediate and severe. This aligns with the legal standard that deadly force is permissible only to prevent death or serious bodily injury. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately resorting to the use of a firearm upon perceiving any threat, without first attempting to de-escalate or assess the severity of the danger. This fails to meet the legal standard of using only necessary force and ignores the principle of proportionality. Iowa law does not grant a blanket right to use deadly force against any perceived threat. It must be a response to an imminent danger of death or serious injury. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the subjective feeling of fear without an objective basis for that fear. While fear is a natural response, legal justification for using deadly force in Iowa is based on whether a reasonable person in the same situation would have perceived an imminent threat of death or serious injury. Acting solely on subjective fear, without objective evidence of such a threat, can lead to unlawful use of force. A further incorrect approach is to assume that because one possesses a permit to carry a concealed weapon, they are authorized to use it in any situation where they feel threatened. A permit grants the legal right to carry, not an unfettered right to use the weapon. The permit holder remains bound by the same legal standards for self-defense as any other citizen, requiring a demonstrable and imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to justify the use of deadly force. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility. This involves continuous training on Iowa Code Chapter 724, focusing on the principles of reasonable force, imminent threat, and the duty to retreat where applicable and safe. Before any action is taken, a rapid but thorough assessment of the situation is crucial. Is there an unlawful attack? Is there an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury? Are there safe alternatives to using force? If deadly force is contemplated, it must be the absolute last resort, proportional to the threat, and undertaken with the understanding that every action will be scrutinized against the legal standards of Iowa. Question 17. Market research demonstrates that individuals holding a valid Iowa permit to carry weapons may encounter various social interactions. Imagine you are lawfully carrying a concealed handgun in Iowa and are inside a restaurant. Another patron makes a rude, but not directly threatening, comment about your perceived presence as a gun owner. You are not being asked to leave by management, and there is no immediate danger. What is the most prudent course of action to uphold both your legal rights and responsible conduct? Option A. Discreetly leave the establishment without further interaction or drawing attention to yourself or your firearm. Option B. Adjust your clothing to make the presence of your concealed firearm more noticeable to the patron who made the comment. Option C. Immediately approach the restaurant manager and demand that the patron be removed for making an offensive remark. Option D. Politely but firmly confront the patron, explaining your legal right to carry a concealed weapon in Iowa. The correct answer is A. Discreetly leave the establishment without further interaction or drawing attention to yourself or your firearm. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the nuances of Iowa's permit to carry weapons regulations while also considering the ethical implications of their actions in a public space. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the legal right to carry a concealed weapon with the responsibility to avoid actions that could be perceived as threatening or that could escalate a situation unnecessarily, even if technically legal. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the exercise of a legal right does not infringe upon the peace and safety of others. The best professional approach involves prioritizing de-escalation and avoiding any action that could be misconstrued as aggressive or confrontational. This means remaining calm, assessing the situation objectively, and making a conscious decision to disengage from any potential conflict. The legal framework in Iowa, while permitting concealed carry for those with a permit, does not grant carte blanche to act in a manner that could reasonably cause alarm. The ethical responsibility extends beyond mere legal compliance to encompass a duty of care towards the public. Therefore, the most appropriate action is to leave the establishment without drawing attention or making any overt gestures related to the firearm. An incorrect approach would be to remain in the establishment and make a visible, albeit subtle, display of the firearm, such as adjusting clothing to make the holster more apparent. This action, while not explicitly prohibited by Iowa law as a direct act of brandishing, could easily be interpreted by others as a veiled threat or an attempt to intimidate, thereby creating an environment of fear and potentially escalating tensions. This fails to uphold the ethical responsibility to avoid causing undue alarm. Another incorrect approach would be to confront the individual who made the comment, even if the intent is to assert one's rights. Engaging in a verbal confrontation, especially when carrying a concealed weapon, significantly increases the risk of escalation. Iowa law does not mandate or encourage confrontation in such situations. Rather, it permits carry for self-defense. Provoking a confrontation negates the principle of responsible firearm ownership and could lead to unintended legal or physical consequences. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to immediately report the comment to law enforcement without first assessing the immediate threat level or attempting to de-escalate. While reporting potentially concerning behavior is sometimes appropriate, in this specific scenario, the comment, while rude, does not immediately constitute a direct threat to safety that would necessitate immediate law enforcement intervention. Over-reliance on law enforcement for minor provocations can strain resources and may not be the most effective way to manage the situation. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a rapid assessment of the environment and the nature of any perceived threat. The primary goal should be to maintain personal safety and public order. This involves a conscious effort to de-escalate, disengage from potentially volatile interactions, and avoid any actions that could be misinterpreted as aggressive or threatening. Legal rights must be exercised responsibly, with a keen awareness of the potential impact on others and a commitment to ethical conduct. Question 18. Process analysis reveals that an individual holding a valid Iowa permit to carry weapons observes a heated verbal argument between two strangers in a public park. While no physical contact has occurred, one individual is gesturing aggressively and shouting. The permit holder feels increasingly uneasy and believes the situation could escalate. Considering Iowa's legal framework for carrying weapons and the use of force, what is the most appropriate course of action for the permit holder? Option A. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct engagement, and only consider intervention if there is an immediate and unavoidable threat of death or serious bodily injury to themselves or others, in accordance with Iowa Code Chapter 724. Option B. Approach the individuals, announce they are legally armed, and attempt to de-escalate the situation by verbally intervening and asserting authority. Option C. Leave the area immediately and report the incident to park authorities or law enforcement without direct involvement. Option D. Draw their firearm to signal their presence and deter further escalation of the argument. The correct answer is A. Maintain situational awareness, avoid direct engagement, and only consider intervention if there is an immediate and unavoidable threat of death or serious bodily injury to themselves or others, in accordance with Iowa Code Chapter 724. Explanation: Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a firearm in Iowa. The core difficulty lies in interpreting the nuances of Iowa law regarding the use of deadly force and the circumstances under which a permit to carry is valid, especially when faced with a perceived threat that may not escalate to immediate physical danger. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could lead to legal repercussions or endanger others. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Iowa Code Chapter 724, specifically the provisions governing permits to carry weapons and the justifiable use of force. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever safely possible, recognizing that the permit to carry is not a license to engage in aggressive behavior or to use force preemptively. It emphasizes that the use of deadly force is a last resort, justifiable only when there is an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury. This aligns with the legal framework that permits carrying a weapon for self-defense, but does not grant authority to act as law enforcement or to use force in situations that do not meet the strict legal definition of justifiable homicide or assault defense. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming the permit to carry grants broad authority to intervene in any perceived disturbance, regardless of the immediacy of the threat. This fails to recognize that Iowa law restricts the use of force to situations where it is necessary to prevent imminent harm. Acting on a perceived threat that does not meet this threshold could constitute assault or other offenses. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on personal feelings of unease or a general sense of danger without concrete evidence of an immediate threat. Iowa law requires a reasonable belief that deadly force is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury. Acting solely on subjective feelings, without objective justification, violates this legal standard. A further incorrect approach is to brandish the firearm as a warning or to intimidate an individual, even if no physical confrontation has occurred. This action can escalate a situation unnecessarily and may be considered unlawful exhibition of a weapon or a precursor to assault, depending on the specific circumstances and intent, and is not a permissible use of a concealed weapon under Iowa law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Iowa carrying a weapon under a permit should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, de-escalation, and strict adherence to legal statutes. This involves 1. Assessing the immediate threat level objectively, focusing on imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury. 2. Prioritizing avoidance and de-escalation strategies. 3. Understanding that the permit is for self-defense, not for proactive intervention or enforcement. 4. Consulting Iowa Code Chapter 724 and relevant case law for a clear understanding of justifiable use of force. 5. Seeking legal counsel if unsure about the application of laws to a specific situation. Question 19. Strategic planning requires an applicant seeking a permit to carry weapons in Iowa to consider all aspects of the application process. If an applicant has a past romantic relationship with a law enforcement officer who works in the county where the permit application will be processed and who may be involved in conducting the background check, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the applicant to take? Option A. Omit any mention of the past relationship and hope that it does not surface during the background investigation. Option B. Assume the past relationship will not affect the background check and proceed with the application without mentioning it. Option C. Contact the former partner to inquire about the status of the background check and subtly remind them of the past relationship. Option D. Proactively inform the sheriff's office of the past relationship and request that appropriate measures be taken to ensure an impartial background check. The correct answer is D. Proactively inform the sheriff's office of the past relationship and request that appropriate measures be taken to ensure an impartial background check. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a personal relationship and the strict requirements of the Iowa permit to carry weapons law. The applicant's desire to obtain a permit, coupled with a past relationship with a law enforcement officer who has access to sensitive information, creates a situation where impartiality and adherence to legal standards are paramount. Failure to navigate this situation correctly could lead to a flawed permit decision, potential legal repercussions, and a breach of public trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure the integrity of the permitting process and to uphold the spirit and letter of Iowa law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a transparent and proactive disclosure of the relationship to the issuing authority. This approach directly addresses the potential for perceived or actual bias. By informing the sheriff's office about the past relationship with the officer who will be involved in the background check, the applicant allows the sheriff's office to implement appropriate safeguards, such as assigning a different officer to conduct the background investigation or implementing enhanced scrutiny. This aligns with the Iowa permit to carry weapons law's emphasis on a thorough and impartial background check to ensure public safety. Transparency and cooperation with the authorities are key ethical and legal obligations in such situations. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume the past relationship will not influence the background check and to proceed without disclosure. This fails to acknowledge the potential for unconscious bias or the appearance of impropriety, which can undermine the credibility of the permitting process. Iowa law requires a thorough background check, and failing to disclose a relevant personal connection risks compromising the impartiality of that check. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to leverage the past relationship to expedite or influence the permit process. This is ethically reprehensible and a direct violation of the principles of fairness and equal treatment under the law. Such an action would not only be illegal, but would also demonstrate a severe lack of integrity and respect for the legal framework governing firearm permits in Iowa. A further incorrect approach is to withhold information about the relationship and hope it goes unnoticed. This constitutes a deliberate act of deception. The Iowa permit to carry weapons law mandates that applicants provide truthful and complete information. Concealing a material fact, such as a past relationship with an individual involved in the background check, is a violation of this requirement and could lead to the denial of the permit or revocation if granted. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should follow a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, legal compliance, and ethical conduct. First, identify any potential conflicts of interest or situations that could compromise impartiality. Second, Consult the relevant regulations, in this case, the Iowa Permit to Carry Weapons Law, to understand specific disclosure requirements and background check procedures. Third, proactively disclose any relevant information to the appropriate authority, allowing them to manage the situation appropriately. Fourth, cooperate fully with the authorities and provide any further information requested. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are made in accordance with legal mandates and ethical standards, safeguarding the integrity of the process. Question 20. Market research demonstrates that individuals seeking to renew their Iowa permit to carry weapons often struggle with applying the legal standards for self-defense to real-world scenarios. Consider a situation where John, an Iowa permit holder, is at a crowded farmer's market. He observes an individual, Mark, who is visibly intoxicated and shouting threats at bystanders. Mark then begins to advance rapidly towards a young child who is separated from their parents, reaching into his jacket pocket. John believes Mark intends to harm the child. If John were to use deadly force to stop Mark, how would a legal assessment under Iowa law likely evaluate the proportionality of his actions, considering the potential harm to the child versus the potential harm to Mark? Option A. John's actions would be deemed disproportionate because Mark had not yet physically produced a weapon from his pocket, and therefore the threat was not sufficiently imminent to justify deadly force. Option B. John's actions would likely be deemed proportionate if a reasonable person in John's position would have perceived an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the child, and the use of deadly force was necessary to prevent that harm, even if Mark was not yet physically touching the child or brandishing a weapon openly. Option C. John's actions would be deemed proportionate solely based on Mark's aggressive shouting and intoxication, regardless of his proximity to the child or his actions within his jacket. Option D. John's actions would be deemed disproportionate because the potential harm to Mark, if he were shot, is a quantifiable loss that outweighs the speculative harm to the child. The correct answer is B. John's actions would likely be deemed proportionate if a reasonable person in John's position would have perceived an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the child, and the use of deadly force was necessary to prevent that harm, even if Mark was not yet physically touching the child or brandishing a weapon openly. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Iowa's permit to carry weapons law, specifically concerning the permissible use of force in defense of oneself or others. The core difficulty lies in assessing whether a reasonable person, under the circumstances described, would perceive an imminent threat justifying the use of deadly force, and how to quantify the potential harm to determine the proportionality of the response. This requires a deep understanding of Iowa Code Chapter 724 and relevant case law, balancing the right to self-defense with the legal restrictions on the use of force. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of the totality of the circumstances as they reasonably appeared to the permit holder at the moment of the incident. This includes evaluating the aggressor's actions, words, physical capabilities, and the environment. Specifically, it requires determining if there was an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, and if the permit holder's actions were a necessary and proportionate response to that threat. Iowa law generally permits the use of force, including deadly force, when a person reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily injury to themselves or another person. The calculation of potential harm is not a precise mathematical formula, but a qualitative assessment of the perceived danger. For instance, if an individual is brandishing a weapon and advancing aggressively, the perceived threat of serious bodily injury is high, justifying a defensive response. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the aggressor's intent without considering the imminence of the threat or the proportionality of the response. For example, if the aggressor expressed hostile intent but made no overt aggressive movements and was at a considerable distance, the threat might not be considered imminent under Iowa law, and the use of deadly force would likely be unjustified. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the permit holder's subjective fear over objective reasonableness. While subjective fear is a component, the legal standard requires that the fear be objectively reasonable given the circumstances. Relying solely on a feeling of being threatened, without a factual basis that a reasonable person would also perceive an imminent danger, is legally insufficient. Finally, An approach that attempts to precisely quantify potential harm using a rigid mathematical formula is inappropriate. The law requires a reasonable assessment of the perceived danger, not a statistical calculation of probabilities. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations must adopt a framework that prioritizes objective reasonableness, imminence of threat, and proportionality of force, all within the specific legal parameters of Iowa Code Chapter 724. This involves a careful, step-by-step evaluation of the facts as they reasonably appeared to the individual at the time of the incident. The decision-making process should begin with identifying the perceived threat, assessing its imminence, and then determining if the force used was necessary and proportionate to neutralize that threat without exceeding what was reasonably required. This analytical process ensures adherence to legal standards and ethical responsibilities.